very much. And my brain is numb by all those numbers that Chris just gave. And sorry to say as well, just full disclosure, I'm not paid to be here, although I'm staying on an extra day. I think my hotel might be reimbursed, I don't know. But the whole idea that I have to start by saying that I'm not paid so much as a cup of coffee. Oh, I had a coffee, sorry. It gives you an idea how the scales are not balanced at all. And that's really the type of situation we're in now here. I'm a professor. I write a blog called the Risk Mongerer, which I basically do to try to figure out what's going on in the world as we're trying to figure out what's going on with my slides. I have to have some slides as well because I'm afraid you'll have copies of the slides you want because there's a lot of screenshots and lots of different things that I don't think you'll find elsewhere. But I want to start with a couple of definitions first, just so we know we're on the same table. I'm going to talk about not so much the financial corruption, but what I'd call the scientific corruption that's going on, in particular one agency known as the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, or IARC, depends how you want to call it. But let's start with a few definitions, basic. First of all, I coined this term about 4 or 5 years ago called activist scientist, to separate what a credible scientist does, which is gathers evidence and draws a conclusion, from an activist scientist who would start with the conclusion and then look for the evidence. And with spectrometry and chromatographs today, you can basically prove anything you want to do. You can find a trace of some element in your Cheerios without much problem. And credible scientists will release data and allow the risk managers to discuss what to do. An activist scientist will basically have a PR manager, usually an NGO now, beside them campaigning. And that's what a lab is useful for in this case. And the last point as well is the scientist really should always be challenging the scientific theories, being able to replicate or falsify it to have a more robust science. Whereas when you talk about a consensus, usually it's the activists who want the consensus. And if you dare disagree with them, then you find out quite quickly what happened. So just to make sure you realize there are different shades of white. In fact, I gave a talk one time called 50 Shades of White, and it really is a question that when they say they're a scientist, you may have to look a little bit closer. The second definition that's important for you to understand is the difference of risk and hazard. There's traffic on the street out there that is definitely a hazard, but given that I'm safely tucked into a chair here, I'm not exposed to that hazard. So the cars on the streets are not in any way a risk. And I think that's important to realize that. I give a good example. If you want to, there are sharks in the ocean, those are definitely hazardous. But if you're not exposed to them or probability of being exposed to the shark, then I don't think we have to demand for your own safety that all sharks be culled. And I think what's important to realize with that is that what IARC does is not a risk assessment, but they do a hazard assessment. They will be able to say, through rather interesting research they can generate, that there may be a potential hazard for cancer from a certain chemical or from vaping or from a mobile phone, but they're not telling you how deeply you're exposed to it. And there's an important difference there. What they generate is simply saying there's a hazard here, you may want to look further. But recently they've started to get a little bit more into what should come out from their reports. A bit about IARC itself. They essentially have two functions. One's to collect data, look at trends in cancers, and host a lot of meetings, these wonderful WHO meetings that Fred talked about. But they also do monographs, which are the hazard assessments. And these monographs have started to be used in different ways, and I think it's important to see that. Is it part of the WHO? Frankly, no. And this is one of the things we always see, that they talk about. The WHO says this gives you cancer, that gives you cancer. But it was a French agency which in 1965 at a plenary, Charles de Gaulle basically came in and said this should be a WHO agency. In usual de Gaullean fashion, nobody was able to discuss it with him. So they thought, well, what the hell? They're not financed in any way by the WHO. They're self-financed, so they talk about the fact that they're an autonomous agency. They're financed particularly by donations. Next time you do a pink ribbon run, keep in mind that that agency or that cancer fund may be donating some money to some bureaucrats in Lyon. But most of their funding comes from the 26 member states. So the basic 26 rich countries in the West And so it's not really, it is independent. It's a bit like my rich uncle who I really detest. As long as I don't have to see him, it's fine. And WHO has no scrutiny on what they do and how they're funding. And they're really quite simply a separate organization that still carries on with the UN flag. There was a credibility crisis in the 90s, I think, where industry was involved in a certain number of studies, and there were a few resignations. And in fact, there's a rather bizarre story, particularly of a former head of IARC who's no longer allowed. His credentials were completely removed. And after that time, IARC took a rather strong reactive point against industry. And in fact, what we've seen in the last few years is that the civil servants in IARC have become quite simply militant and activist. And I'll show you some screenshots of some emails that may be alarming. Just to give you an example, they celebrated the 50th anniversary a few years back. 2,000 scientists, the great and the good in cancer research came. I looked at the invite list. I've got a copy if you want to see it. Not one person from industry was invited. Not one person from the pharmaceutical industry, which is doing a lot of the research in cancer. No. In fact, they found these rather strange people from these, Thai herbal medicine organizations, but nobody in medicine and pharmaceutical research was invited. So to give you an idea of where their views are towards it. IARC claims all the time that they're very transparent and they only use publicly available sources. This is, of course, not true. The first example here is a letter from the director, Chris Wilde, who simply wrote a response to the US government that was having a hearing to try to look at what IARC was doing, and IARC refused to bother to go to Washington to attend this hearing. And they simply also said, we hope that you will respect the inviolability of their archives and their documents. You're not allowed to see emails or discussions or any process which EFSA, for example, the European Food Safety Authority, do on a basis of full transparency. IARC refuses that. They also say they only use publicly accessible documents. That's why they didn't use a lot of the documents in the glyphosate case. Well, that's also not true. Here is a confidentially undertaking that researchers who are doing the welding fumes study were told that they were going to be using some unpublished documents, so they had to sign a confidentiality agreement. So they only use publicly available documents unless it's going to support their findings. They've been rather scientifically cavalier as well. A good example, once again, on the glyphosate monograph, the head of the monograph, Aaron Blair, was involved in the American Health study, which looked at 60,000 farmers over 20 years. And it showed no effects coming from their use of glyphosate in any cancers. And Blair admitted that if he worked on the study, but they decided not to bring it in because it hadn't been completely published at that time. But he admitted that their findings would be different if the chair of that panel would be allowed to bring it in. So the cherry picking is correct. Thanks, I'm not finished yet. The chair of the when you look at how the chairs are selected, how the panelists are selected, you get a rather strange situation where most of them have declared biases that the substances are carcinogenic. And I've got some data which shows in some cases some of the panels were 80% biased before they even sat down in Lyon to work on a monograph. And there's also been evidence, and it's nice to see Kate here today. This is a quote from one of her articles. I think you won an award for this, didn't you? I don't know. So, congratulations. Sorry, flashing. But there's evidence that after the meeting, the drafts before they were published as a monograph, somebody within IARC, I have my suspicions, went through and edited out parts of the text to make it look a little bit more carcinogenic than the evidence actually was agreed upon. Okay. Now, where does IARC get their people? They have a network of good old boys who regularly serve on panels. And you see the same names coming back regularly. And it's rather difficult to know their selection process, but like a lot of international organizations, they have people they like in the room and they keep inviting them back, even if they're not at all qualified. And because we were so lucky to have a lot of publications of the Daubert hearings made available for the glyphosate case, thanks to US Right to Know, I found this from the Chris Portier one, and he admitted that prior to being appointed to the working group 1112, that's on glyphosate, I had not looked at the scientific evidence on the carcinogenicity of glyphosate. So of the 15 best people in the world to speak about Chris Portier being one of them, had no idea about the substance. And so it gives you an idea how their selection process is being done. But how do they actually attract scientists? Because they're not paid. They're not allowed to pay scientists to come for a week. It's a quite heavy workload, quite tight deadlines. So they have to give incentives in some way to make sure that the good scientists come. Well, one of the things, of course, many scientists like to do is have their own publications pushed into the reports. So you see, 2 minutes, wow, already, okay. So there's a good case of, I won't have time to get into the details, but Martin T. Smith in one study got 10 of his papers cited in an IARC report, of course, which helps generate more. They're tied a lot to the Collegium Ramazzini, but they're also, you find that it's like a revolving door, that once a scientist works on IARC, they can go into what I consider the litigation consultant profession, where you have these tort lawsuits in the US to sue people. Now you've got to understand it from another context. In the 90s, the tobacco industry provided a rather interesting side profession for law firms suing the tobacco industry. And these tort lawyers moved from the strip malls into nice offices during this time. The money was good. But once that agreement came, they were no longer able to continually sue tobacco companies. So they had to look elsewhere. And IARC provided a rather good source of revenue for new carcinogens and new industries that they could sue. I'm not going to get into the lawyer playbook. I'm going to be coming out with a series of blogs on this, by the way. It's where I'm going to be looking at how the law firms have changed the way research is done. But what we're seeing is that these large litigation payouts are creating a revenue stream for scientific consultants. If you look at the 300 million or 400 million that these law firms are getting from settlements, what's a couple million to pay a couple scientists to be on staff to provide the evidence? And you can see some of the litigation windfalls here. I mean, the Proposition 65 bounty hunters are just incredible. They'll swab down a door handle in Disneyland, find some chemical under Proposition 65 that's a carcinogen, and then blackmail Disney to pay them some money. And Disney usually pays them off quite a bit. J&J, one of the leading research firms on cancer and finding solutions for cancer, has 4,000 lawsuits against them on talcum powder based on a very dodgy IARC report that even the scientists couldn't agree on at the time. 7,500 against Monsanto. I think that number went up since I wrote this yesterday. And we see also diesel exhaust, benzene, welding fumes. There's a lot of cases like this. And what we have now, of course, the big asbestos of the future is your mobile phone in your pocket. My question here, of course, and what I want to show you some points on, is how much does IARC know about their role as useful idiots? The Portier papers are fairly clear. This document's, you can see, but essentially what happens is you find that the relationship that a scientist who's working, for example, with law firms, in this case, Portier was working on mobile phones before he went there. 9 days after they had a judgment that glyphosate was included, he basically signed a contract, and he's received about $500,000, I think, until now, in the last 3 years, just serving 2 law firms. So I'm running short on time, so I'll skip over Martin T. Smith, my favorite guy. But just to give you an idea, well, how is IARC involved? Well, Kate Guyton is regularly in email correspondence with people like Chris Portier and Martin T. Smith. And she's taking data, for example, from GM Watch and forwarding it on to these people. She's also arranging meetings with journalists like Le Monde's Foucault in order to essentially to trash EFSA. And when you start to see these types of actions, you begin to realize that Kate Guyton is very tied into not simply the best science, but making sure that substances get banned. So I just got 5 little points of advice. First of all, it needs structure. Don't shut IARC down. The US was looking at pulling out. They may have already pulled out. That just means that the French will probably up their amounts. But you have got to stop the hazard-based reports are just nonsense and just provides NGOs and law firms with ammunition to fleece others. You have to start taking other scientists, particularly cancer researchers. IARC staff should not be involved in other lucrative forms of business, particularly the Collegium Ramazzini, where a lot of money is being made available to them as well. It's not a transparent, accountable culture, and there should be some scrutiny body outside, and the WHA should take some role. Now, there is a new person coming in, Elisabetta Wiederpass. Will she bring in some fresh air? Well, I was monitoring the Twitter page on the days leading up to the new person being named, and the day she was named, one of her first actions was to ban me. And a lot of my friends are very jealous because they didn't get banned, and so they keep trying. But anyway, you never know. But anyway, you can tweet me. I promise I won't ban you. It's my last name at Zaruk as well. But thank you very much. I didn't ask for applause.